The morning of September 19th, 1944, southeast of Aachen, Germany, near a small village called Münsterbusch. The Siegfried Line lay ahead, a network of concrete teeth and steel that had waited 4 years for this moment. Staff Sergeant Lafayette Poole sat in the commander's hatch of his Sherman tank, scanning the tree line through field glasses as evening shadows stretched across the cratered road. Behind him, the rest of Combat Command A waited for the order to advance. In front of him, somewhere in that darkness, German Panther tanks watched and waited. Poole lowered the glasses and spoke into the intercom, his Texas drawl cutting through the engine noise. "Baby, you see that ditch on the left? That's our problem. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today." Below him, in the driver's position, Corporal Wilbert Richards shifted in his seat. At 5 feet 4 inches, Richards needed every advantage he could get to see through the Sherman's narrow vision slits, but Poole trusted him more than any driver in Europe. "I see it, War Daddy. You want me to hug the right?" "Negative. Straight through, but slow." Poole glanced back at the turret. Inside, Corporal Willis Oller sat at the gunner's position, hand on the traverse control, eye to the periscope. Beside him, Technician 5th grade Del Boggs stood ready at the loader's station, a 76mm armor-piercing round already chambered. In the bow gunner position, Private First Class Bert Close gripped his .30 caliber machine gun, barely visible in the cramped space beside Richards. This was the third Sherman tank to carry the name In the Mood. The first had lasted 6 days, the second 47 days. This one had survived 33 days of combat across France, Belgium, and now into Germany itself. Together, this crew had destroyed 12 German tanks and 258 other armoured vehicles. They had killed over 1,000 German soldiers and captured 250 more. They had done this in 81 days of continuous combat, an average of more than 3 enemy vehicles destroyed every single day. And tonight, just hours before they were scheduled to rotate back to the United States for a war bond tour, Poole had been ordered to take a flanking position instead of his usual place at the spearhead of the attack. His commanding officer wanted to bring them home alive. Poole understood the reasoning, but it didn't sit right. Leading from the front was what he did. It was what they all did. The radio crackled. The attack was beginning. "All right, boys," Poole said. "Let's go bring some people home." Richards eased the Sherman forward. The tank's suspension groaned as it navigated the broken road, 30 tons of steel and ammunition moving through the gathering darkness. Poole kept his eyes on the tree line, on the shadows that might hide an 88mm anti-tank gun, on the spaces between buildings where a Panzerfaust team might be waiting. Then he saw it, a flicker of movement in a grove of trees to the left, the distinctive angular silhouette of a panther's sloped armor. Panther, left front. Oller was already traversing the turret, the electric motor whining as the 76mm gun swung toward the target. But the German crew had seen them first. The Panther's long gun erupted in a flash of orange fire. The world became noise and violence. The German shell struck In the Mood on the forward hull, the impact like being inside a church bell as it was struck with a sledgehammer. The tank lurched, and Poole heard Richards shouting something he couldn't make out over the ringing in his ears. "Back up! Back us up!" Poole yelled into the intercom. Richards threw the Sherman into reverse, but the tank was fighting him. Something in the transmission screamed in protest. They were moving, but too slowly, and Poole could see the Panther's gun already reloading, the loader inside that German tank working with the same desperate speed as Boggs worked inside theirs. The second shell caught them as they reached the edge of the ditch. This time the impact was on the turret side, and the force of it tipped the Sherman sideways. Poole felt himself lifted out of the commander's hatch, blown clear by the blast, and then he was tumbling through the air. He hit the ground hard, his right leg twisted beneath him, and when he tried to stand, he saw what the shell fragment had done. His leg was ruined. The whole lower portion was mangled, barely attached, bleeding in pulses that meant an artery had been severed. He tried to call out to his crew, but the words wouldn't come. The last thing he saw before the darkness took him was in the mood, lying on its side in the ditch, smoke pouring from the hatches, and 4 figures crawling out into the night. This moment, this final violent second, in a tank commander's career, marked the end of the most devastating 81 days any American tank crew would experience in the entire Second World War. But to understand how 5 men from different corners of America came to be the most lethal armoured unit in the European theatre, you have to go back to the beginning. Back to a time when the Sherman tank was considered a death trap, when American armoured doctrine was unproven, and when a tall, quiet Texan with a gift for violence decided that he wanted to command one of the best tank crews in the division. Lafayette Greenpool was born on July 23, 1919, on a farm in Odem, Texas, a small town where everybody knew everybody, and where the Great War was still recent enough to shape how young men thought about service. He grew up working the land, learning the kind of patience and attention to detail that farming demands, but also learning that he was good at fighting. In high school in Taft, Texas, Poole discovered boxing. He was tall and lanky, with quick hands and the ability to absorb punishment without flinching. He won the sectional 165-pound boxing crown in New Orleans, and when offered a chance to compete in the Golden Gloves national finals, he turned it down. Not because he was afraid, but because he had other plans. He enrolled at Texas College of Arts and Industries in Kingsville, studying engineering, learning the mathematics of stress and load-bearing, of how machines worked and how they failed. But in 1941, with war spreading across Europe and the Pacific, Poole left college and enlisted in the Army. He reported to Fort Sam Houston on June 13, 1941, exactly 6 months before Pearl Harbor would make his decision seem prescient rather than premature. The Army sent him to Camp Beauregard, Louisiana, where the newly formed 3rd Armored Division was learning how to fight with tanks. The M4 Sherman medium tank was just entering production. It weighed 33 tons, carried a crew of 5, and mounted either a 75mm or 76mm main gun. Its armour was sloped but relatively thin, nowhere near the thickness of German Tigers or Panthers. Its gasoline engine was prone to fires. American tankers called it a Ronson, after the cigarette lighter company, whose advertising slogan was, "Lights first time, every time." But Poole saw something else in the Sherman. He saw a tank that was fast, reliable, and produced in numbers the Germans couldn't match. He saw a weapon that, in the right hands, could be devastating. When the opportunity came to volunteer for tank duty, he took it. When the new Shermans arrived and officers were looking for men to train with them, Poole gave up a championship boxing match so he could spend more time learning the tank's systems, its strengths and weaknesses, the distances at which its gun could penetrate different thicknesses of armour. He was promoted to corporal, then sergeant, then staff sergeant, and all the while he was building his crew. Wilbert Richards came from small-town America, barely taller than 5 feet, but with an instinct for driving that Poole recognized immediately. Poole started calling him Baby, a nickname that stuck, and Richards could put the 30-ton Sherman exactly where Poole needed it, could parallel park it in spaces that seemed impossibly tight, could back it through smoke and fire without hesitation. Bert Close was 17 years old when he joined the crew, which earned him the nickname Schoolboy. He manned the bow machine gun, a position that meant sitting in the most vulnerable part of the tank, looking out through a narrow slit of armoured glass, while 30 caliber rounds chewed through German infantry positions. Close was quiet, methodical, and utterly unshakable under fire. Willis Oller became Groundhog. Though the origins of that nickname are lost to time, he sat in the rest-ring gunner's position, where accuracy meant the difference between killing the enemy tank or being killed by it. In a Sherman, the commander also served as the primary gunner, but Ola worked the traverse controls, adjusted for range and wind, loaded the coaxial machine gun, and kept the sights calibrated. He and Poole developed a rhythm, a wordless communication where Poole would identify the target and Ola would already be bringing the gun to bear. Del Boggs, the loader, got the nickname Jailbird, though there's no record he ever served time. What mattered was that he could load a 76mm shell in under 4 seconds, could do it in the dark, could do it while the tank was lurching over rough ground and German rounds were sparking off the armour. The loader's job was to feed the gun, and Boggs fed it with mechanical efficiency. They trained together for almost 3 years. 3 years of learning how to move as one unit, how to anticipate each other's actions, how to fight and survive in a metal box that could become a tomb in seconds. Poole was a demanding commander. He drilled them constantly, insisted on perfection, refused to accept anything less than excellence. His crew loved him for it, because they understood what he understood, that the only way to survive was to be better than everyone else. In June of 1944, the 3rd Armoured Division landed at Omaha Beach in Normandy. Poole's unit, Company I of the 32nd Armoured Regiment, came ashore on June 24th, 3 weeks after D-Day. The bocage country of Normandy was a nightmare for armoured warfare, narrow lanes between high earthen banks topped with hedgerows, every field a potential killing ground, every corner a place where a German anti-tank gun might be waiting. The division spent 3 weeks in reserve, watching the casualties mount from other units, hearing the stories of tanks brewed up by Panzerfausts and 88mm guns. On June 23rd, Poole and his crew received their first Sherman, an M4 Ione with the short-barreled 75mm gun. Poole named it In the Mood, after the Glenn Miller song that was playing everywhere that summer. When someone asked him why that name, Poole said, "That's the way I felt then, just in the mood for anything." Their first combat action came on June 29, 1944, at a town called Villiers-Fossard, north of Saint-Lô. Combat Command A was ordered to attack German positions held by the 2nd Panzer Division to give the nearby 19th Corps room to straighten their lines. It was a limited objective attack, the kind of bloody close-quarters fighting that characterized the Normandy campaign. Poole's platoon led the advance into the village of Les Forges. The buildings were mostly rubble, smoke hanging in the streets from artillery fire, the distinctive crack of German machine guns echoing off broken walls. Richards guided the Sherman through the narrow street, close-firing the bow gun at movement in windows, Ola tracking targets with the main gun. They turned a corner and a German soldier stood up from behind a pile of debris, a Panzerfaust anti-tank weapon on his shoulder. The Panzerfaust was simple and brutally effective, a throwaway tube that launched a shaped charge warhead capable of penetrating 4 inches of armour at close range. The German fired before close could bring the machine gun to bear. The shaped charge struck the Sherman's frontal armour with a flash and a bang that filled the interior with smoke and shrapnel. Richards immediately hit the brakes. "We're hit! Everybody out!" Poole shouted, already popping the commander's hatch. The crew evacuated in seconds, training taking over, each man knowing exactly where to go and what to do. They scrambled away from the burning tank and took cover behind a stone wall as German small arms fire kicked up dirt around them. In the Mood burned for 20 minutes before the ammunition cooked off, the turret lifting off the hull in a shower of sparks and metal. Poole watched it burn and felt something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief, but somewhere in between. 6 days. That's how long their first tank had lasted, but they were all alive, and that's what mattered. The crew stayed together, and on July 1st, they received their second Sherman, this one an M4 Ione 76W, with the upgraded long-barreled 76mm gun that could punch through heavier German armour. Poole had it painted with the same name, In the Mood too. And this time, with better armour penetration and with their first taste of combat behind them, Poole and his crew began to build their reputation. The breakout from Normandy came in late July. Operation Cobra, a massive aerial bombardment followed by armoured exploitation, shattered the German defensive line and sent American tanks racing across France. The 3rd Armoured Division was part of that breakout, and Poole's crew was almost always in the lead. On August 2nd, near the town of Mortain, In the Mood 2 was leading a column of American armour when they took fire from their left flank. A mixed German force, nothing organised, just remnants of units that had been scattered by the American advance, was trying to hit them from the side. Poole ordered the column to continue forward while he turned to deal with the threat. What followed was a close-range brawl in the French countryside, the kind of fighting where distance didn't matter and the crew that fired first usually won. Poole's crew engaged 2 German armoured cars, a half-track, and 3 trucks carrying infantry. Richards manoeuvred the Sherman through hedgerows and across farm fields, giving Oller clear shots at each target. Boggs loaded shell after shell, the empty casings clanging on the turret floor. Close's bow gun chattered continuously, cutting down German soldiers as they tried to dismount from their vehicles. When the shooting stopped, they had destroyed or disabled every enemy vehicle. German bodies lay scattered across 2 fields. Poole reported 70 enemy casualties, including 3 armoured vehicles destroyed. The entire engagement had lasted less than 15 minutes. This became the pattern. Poole had an instinct for where the Germans would be, an ability to read terrain and anticipate enemy positions. He also had a tactical philosophy that seemed simple but was actually quite sophisticated. Get close, get the first shot, and don't stop shooting until nothing is shooting back. The Sherman's armour wasn't thick enough to stop a German 88 at long range, so Poole didn't fight at long range. He closed the distance, using terrain and speed to get within 500 metres where the Sherman's gun was lethal and where the German crews had less time to react. It was aggressive to the point of being reckless, but it worked because Poole's crew was faster and more accurate than almost everyone else. In mid-August, during the pursuit across France toward the Seine River, Combat Command A was clearing German forces from small towns and villages that the Wehrmacht was trying to use as defensive positions. On August 17th, Poole was leading the advance into the village of Fromental when something went catastrophically wrong. An American P-38 Lightning fighter bomber was hunting for German armour, and in the confusion of the advance, with vehicles moving in multiple directions and smoke from burning buildings obscuring the battlefield, the pilot mistook In the Mood 2 for a German tank. The P-38's 20mm cannons opened fire, the high-velocity rounds punching through the Sherman's thinner top armour. Poole saw the aircraft coming in and yelled a warning, but there was nowhere to go. The cannon shells ripped across the turret and engine deck, destroying the engine and setting the fuel tanks ablaze. For the second time in 6 weeks, Poole and his crew bailed out of a burning Sherman, this time with close suffering burns on his hands and Richards taking shrapnel in the arm. They stood on the side of the road and watched In the Mood 2 burn 47 days after they had received it. 2 tanks destroyed, 2 evacuations under fire. And still, every member of the crew was alive. "You boys still want to do this?" Poole asked them, while a medic bandaged Richard's arm. Close, his hands wrapped in gauze, answered for all of them. "War, Daddy, we ain't done yet." They received their 3rd Sherman on August 19th. Another M4 Aoni 76W, another In the Mood, this time with a Roman numeral 3 painted beside the name. And with this tank, over the next month, Poole and his crew would compile a record that no other American tank crew would match in the entire war. Between August 19th and September 19th, In the Mood 3 was credited with destroying 8 German tanks, bringing Poole's total to 12 confirmed tank kills, along with dozens of armoured cars, self-propelled guns, half-tracks, trucks, and other vehicles. The crew estimated they had killed or wounded over 1,000 German soldiers and had personally taken 250 prisoners. They fought through Belgium, through villages with names American soldiers struggled to pronounce, through rain and mud that turned roads into rivers. They fought as Combat Command A pushed toward the German border, toward the Siegfried Line, toward the end of the 3rd Armoured Division's long advance from Normandy. Poole's crew developed a kind of brutal efficiency. They knew each other so well that communication became almost unnecessary. Richards would feel the tank start to slow slightly, Poole's way of signalling he had seen something, and would automatically adjust their position to give Ola the best firing angle. Ola would hear Poole's breathing change on the intercom when he had identified a target, and his hand would already be on the traverse control. Boggs would know from the sound of the gun which type of shell to load next, high explosive for soft targets, armor-piercing for hard ones. They slept in the tank when they could sleep at all, ate cold rations on the move, went days without bathing or changing clothes. The inside of the Sherman smelled like cordite and sweat, and the peculiar metallic odor that comes from being in an enclosed space with too many men and too little ventilation. Close, sitting in the bow gunner position, developed permanent bruises from the recoil of the .30 caliber machine gun. Boggs broke 2 fingers when a shell casing jammed in the loading mechanism, and he forced it clear bare-handed. Richards drove so many hours that his hands cramped into claws, and Poole had to massage them straight before each engagement. But they kept fighting, kept winning, kept surviving when other crews didn't. And the other tankers in the regiment noticed. They started calling Poole's crew the Pups and Poole War Daddy. They drew straws to see who would have to take point on dangerous advances, and Poole would just grin and say, "I'm leading this time," and the others would curse him and follow anyway, because they knew if anyone could get through, it was Poole. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The statistics were staggering. 12 confirmed German tank kills, mostly Panthers, the most dangerous German tank on the Western Front. 258 other armoured vehicles destroyed. But those numbers don't capture what it was actually like, the day-to-day reality of living in a metal box that could kill you in a dozen different ways. The Sherman's greatest weakness was also its greatest strength. It was relatively light, which made it fast and manoeuvrable, but also meant its armour couldn't take punishment from German 88mm guns. The engine ran on gasoline rather than diesel, which meant it caught fire easily, but also meant it was incredibly reliable compared to the temperamental German tanks that broke down constantly. It could be produced in vast quantities. Almost 50,000 Shermans were built during the war, but each individual tank was vulnerable in ways that German heavy tanks weren't. Poole understood this calculus. He knew that in a straight-up fight at long range, a Panther or Tiger would destroy his Sherman every time. But he also knew that most fights weren't straight up. Most fights were ambushes, or meeting engagements in villages, or confused melees in broken terrain where speed and crew training mattered more than armor thickness. He also knew something that many American tank commanders were slower to realize, that the Sherman was never meant to fight other tanks. American doctrine called for tanks to exploit breakthroughs and support infantry. Tank destroyers faster, more lightly armoured vehicles with bigger guns were supposed to handle enemy armour. But doctrine and reality didn't always match, and when a Sherman crew encountered a Panther, doctrine wasn't going to save them. Only speed, accuracy, and aggressive tactics would. By early September, Poole and his crew had been in continuous combat for 70 days. They had fought through Normandy, across France, through Belgium, and now they were approaching Germany itself. The 3rd Armoured Division was exhausted. Men were falling asleep, standing up. Tanks were breaking down faster than they could be repaired. But the momentum of the Allied advance couldn't be stopped. Not yet. Not until the Siegfried Line forced everyone to slow down and dig in for the winter. On September 9th, Poole received word that his crew was being rotated back to the United States for a war bond tour. They had earned it. They had survived longer and fought harder than almost anyone else in the regiment. The plan was to get them out of combat immediately, send them back to England, and then ship them home to tour American cities and sell war bonds by telling their story. But there was one more mission. Combat Command A was preparing to breach the Siegfried Line near Münsterbusch, southeast of Aachen. The attack was scheduled for the night of September 19th. Lieutenant Colonel Richardson, commanding the task force, didn't want to risk Poole and his crew in the main assault. Instead, he assigned them to a flanking position, away from the heaviest fighting. It was meant as a courtesy, a way to keep them safe until they could rotate out. Poole didn't argue, but he didn't like it either. Flanking positions were for support units, not for the tank that had led every major assault the regiment had undertaken for the past 3 months. Still, orders were orders. There was one other problem. Ola was scheduled for a hearing test that day. He'd been experiencing some hearing loss from months of firing, the 76mm gun in an enclosed space, and the medics wanted to check it before he went home. Poole would have to take a replacement gunner for this one mission. On the evening of September 19th, 1944, in the Mood 3, moved into position south of Münsterbusch. The Siegfried Line lay ahead, visible as a series of concrete fortifications and anti-tank obstacles. Intelligence reported that German forces in the area included elements of several panzer divisions, pulled back from the disastrous retreat across France, and reorganized for the defense of German soil. The attack began just after dark. Artillery fire lit up the sky, and American infantry began moving forward, supported by tanks from other platoons. Poole's position was on the left flank, providing covering fire and protecting against a counterattack from that direction. For almost an hour, nothing happened in their sector. They could hear the battle happening ahead of them, the distinctive sound of tank guns and machine guns, the crump of artillery rounds. Richards kept the engine idling, close watched through his vision slit. Boggs had shells stacked and ready. The replacement gunner, whose name has been lost to history, waited at Ola's position. Then Poole saw movement in the tree line to their left front. He raised his field glasses and saw it clearly. A Panther tank, waiting in ambush, its long 75mm gun aimed directly at them. Everything that happened next took less than 30 seconds, but those 30 seconds would define the rest of Lafayette Poole's life. He called out the target. The replacement gunner, not as fast as Ola, began traversing the turret. The Panther fired first. The German armor-piercing round struck in the Mood 3 on the front hull, the impact enormous, the sound beyond describing. Richards tried to back them up, tried to get them out of the Panther's firing line, but the transmission was damaged and the tank was responding sluggishly. Poole knew what was coming. He knew the Panther's loader would be working frantically to chamber another round, just as Boggs would be doing the same in their own turret. He knew it was a race, and he knew they were losing. "Back up," he shouted. "Get us back." Richards got the Sherman moving in reverse, but they were at the edge of a ditch, and the ground was soft, and the damaged transmission was fighting every movement. The Panther's second shot caught them on the turret side just as they reached the ditch's edge. The world became fire and flying metal. Poole felt himself lifted, blown clear of the commander's hatch by the blast, spinning through the air. He hit the ground and tried to stand and couldn't. His right leg wouldn't respond. He looked down and saw what the shell fragment had done, saw the leg barely attached, saw the blood, and thought with strange clarity, "This is bad." He tried to call out to his crew, tried to see if they were getting out, but his voice wouldn't work, and his vision was tunneling down to a narrow point of light. The last thing he heard before unconsciousness took him was Richards shouting his name, and then there was nothing at all. He woke up 3 weeks later in a hospital in England. The doctors told him his leg was gone, amputated above the knee. They told him his crew had all survived, pulled him from the battlefield under fire, stayed with him until the medics arrived. They told him the war was over for him, but what they couldn't tell him, what nobody could tell him yet, was what his 81 days of combat would mean in the larger story of the war. because Lafayette Poole and his crew, Richards, Close, Oller and Boggs, had done something that seemed impossible. They had taken a tank that everyone said was inferior to German armour, and they had made it into the most lethal weapon on the Western Front. The numbers tell part of the story. 12 confirmed German tank kills in 81 days. That's one enemy. Tank destroyed every 7 days, on average. But the distribution wasn't even. Some weeks saw no tank versus tank combat. Other days saw multiple engagements. The real achievement wasn't the raw number, it was the consistency. The fact that Poole and his crew survived long enough to compile those numbers when most tank crews didn't. To understand what made them exceptional, you have to understand what tank combat was actually like in the European theatre in 1944. The Sherman versus Panther matchup was fundamentally unequal. The Panther mounted a long-barreled 75mm gun that could penetrate 4.5 inches of armour at 1,000 metres. The Sherman's frontal armour was at best 3.5 inches thick on the turret face, less on the hull. A Panther could kill a Sherman at ranges where the Sherman couldn't effectively return fire. The Panther's sloped frontal armour was almost 6 inches thick at the equivalent angle, which meant that a Sherman's 76mm gun could only reliably penetrate it from the sides or rear, or from very close range, hitting specific weak points. The Tiger was even worse. Its 88mm gun could destroy a Sherman at 2,000 metres, and its frontal armour was effectively impenetrable to the Sherman's gun at combat ranges. American tankers called encounters with Tigers "meeting God", and the survival advice was simple. Don't fight it alone, call for air support or tank destroyers, and try to survive long enough for help to arrive. But Poole didn't avoid German tanks, he hunted them. His tactical approach was built on several principles that seemed contradictory but worked in practice. First, close the distance. A Sherman couldn't win a long-range duel, so don't fight at long range. Get within 500 metres, where reaction time and crew training mattered more than armour thickness and gun penetration. Second, shoot first. The crew that got off the first accurate shot usually won, regardless of what tank they were in. Third, keep shooting. Even if the first round didn't penetrate, keep firing. Concussion alone could disable enemy crews, and the psychological effect of being under continuous, accurate fire was enormous. Fourth, and perhaps most important, never be where the enemy expected you to be. Poole used terrain aggressively, moving through positions that seemed impossible for tanks, using dead ground and buildings and smoke to close the distance before the enemy could engage effectively. He also moved fast, using the Sherman's superior speed and reliability to get into firing positions before German crews could react. But tactics alone don't explain their success. The real answer lies in something harder to quantify: crew cohesion. Richards, Close, Oller and Boggs weren't just 4 men who happened to be assigned to the same tank. They were a single organism, 5 separate brains connected by the same nervous system. They had trained together for almost 3 years before seeing combat, which was unusual. Most tank crews were assembled shortly before deployment. They had survived 2 tanks being destroyed under them, which meant they trusted each other in ways that fresh crews didn't. And they were led by a commander who demanded perfection and got it because his crew understood that anything less would kill them. Consider what had to happen for a Sherman to engage and destroy an enemy tank. The commander had to spot the target, identify it correctly, determine range, and whether it posed an immediate threat. The gunner had to traverse the turret, adjust elevation, compensate for range and the tank's movement. The loader had to select the correct ammunition type and load it in under 4 seconds. The driver had to position the tank for the best shot while simultaneously watching for terrain obstacles and enemy fire. The bow gunner had to provide suppressing fire on infantry that might be supporting the enemy tank, while also serving as a second set of eyes for the driver. All of this had to happen in seconds, often under direct fire, with German rounds sparking off the armour and the interior of the tank filling with smoke and noise and the smell of cordite. Most crews could do this adequately with training. Poole's crew did it with machine-like precision, again and again, for 81 consecutive days. There was something else too, something that Poole himself recognized but couldn't entirely explain. His crew wasn't afraid of him, but they were more afraid of disappointing him than they were of the Germans. Richards once told a war correspondent, "All Poole wanted was to get out ahead of the other tanks so he could kill more Jerrys. By God, I think we were more scared of Poole than of Jerry." This wasn't fear in the conventional sense. It was the kind of driving force that makes athletes push past exhaustion, that makes soldiers charge enemy positions when every rational instinct says to take cover. Poole had created a culture inside that Sherman, where excellence wasn't optional and where letting down your brothers was worse than dying. The irony is that this psychological dynamic, this absolute commitment to each other and to their mission, was probably what kept them alive. Crews that were merely competent died because mere competence wasn't enough. You had to be better, faster, more aggressive, more willing to take risks. And you had to believe, absolutely and without question, that your crew would do their jobs perfectly because your life depended on it. Poole's leadership style was demanding but not cruel. He never asked his crew to do anything he wouldn't do himself. When In the Mood was burning, Poole was always the last one out, making sure his crew evacuated first. When they were under fire, Poole was the most exposed, sitting in the commander's hatch where he could see the battlefield clearly, but where he was also vulnerable to snipers and artillery fragments. His crew knew that if anyone was going to die first, it would probably be Poole, and that knowledge created a loyalty that went beyond military discipline. The German forces they faced understood what was happening, even if they couldn't stop it. In the confused fighting across France and Belgium, individual German tank commanders began to recognize In the Mood by reputation, if not by sight. There are accounts unverified but persistent of German tank commanders warning each other about the American tank that always attacks first. Whether these accounts are true or not, what matters is that they could have been true. Poole's tactics were distinctive enough, and his success rate was high enough, that enemy crews would have noticed. By September of 1944, the German forces on the Western Front were a mix of veteran units pulled back from the disastrous summer retreat, and fresh units being fed into the line with inadequate training. The veterans knew how dangerous American armor could be when properly handled. The fresh units were still learning, still making the mistakes that Poole's crew exploited ruthlessly. But the Germans also had advantages that weren't always apparent in individual engagements. Their tank doctrine emphasized defensive fighting from prepared positions, which meant they often got to choose where battles happened. Their tanks were mechanically unreliable but had better guns and armor. And most importantly, they were fighting on ground they knew, pulling back through territory where they had prepared defensive positions and knew every road and village. What Poole and his crew did was take every advantage the Sherman offered: speed, reliability, high rate of fire, good crew ergonomics, and maximize it while minimizing every disadvantage through aggressive tactics and superior crew coordination. The Sherman wasn't a bad tank. In many ways it was an excellent tank, but it required a specific type of fighting to be effective, and most tank commanders either couldn't or wouldn't fight that way. Poole could and did, and it cost him his leg. When he woke up in that hospital in England in early October, the war was still going on, but his part in it was over. The doctors told him he was lucky to be alive. The German shell fragment had severed his femoral artery, and he had nearly bled out before the medics reached him. Richards and Close had pulled him from the battlefield, while Boggs and the replacement gunner provided covering fire. They had saved his life, just as he had saved theirs a dozen times before. The crew visited him in the hospital. Richards brought him a bottle of whiskey smuggled past the nurses. Close, whose hearing had been permanently damaged by months of manning the bowgun, could barely hear what Poole was saying but nodded along anyway. Boggs tried to make jokes that fell flat. Oller, who hadn't been there for the final battle and felt guilty about it, apologized until Poole told him to shut up and sit down. They sat around his bed and didn't talk about the fighting much. Instead, they talked about home, about what they would do when the war was over, about the families waiting for them. Poole called them "my pups" one more time, and Richards told him to stop being sentimental, and they all laughed because that's what you did when the alternative was crying. Poole was evacuated to the United States in November. He spent months in military hospitals, learning to walk with a prosthetic leg, enduring the physical therapy and the pain and the slow realization that he would never be the same man he had been. The Army awarded him the Distinguished Service Cross, the Legion of Merit, the Silver Star, the Purple Heart. France awarded him the Légion d'honneur. Belgium gave him the Fourragère. The citations praised his extraordinary heroism in connection with military operations against an armed enemy and detailed specific engagements where his actions had turned the tide of battle. But Poole didn't think of himself as a hero. He thought of himself as a tank commander who had done his job. The real heroes, in his mind, were the men who had served beside him. Richards, who could park a Sherman in spaces that seemed impossible. Close, who had fired his bowgun until his hands bled from the recoil. Oller, whose accuracy with the 76mm gun was legendary in the regiment. Boggs, who could load shells with his eyes closed and his hands burned. Poole's crew all survived the war. Richards returned to civilian life and rarely spoke about his service. Close struggled with hearing loss for the rest of his life. Oller and Boggs both stayed in touch with Poole, exchanging letters and occasional visits, the kind of bond that forms between men who have shared something that cannot be explained to anyone who wasn't there. In 1946, Poole rejoined the army. He couldn't command tanks anymore, not with one leg, but he could train tankers. He spent the next several years teaching a new generation of soldiers what he had learned in 81 days of combat. He taught them about crew cohesion, about aggressive tactics, about the importance of shooting first and moving fast. He taught them that the Sherman wasn't a death trap if you knew how to fight with it. And he taught them that the crew was everything, that individual skill mattered less than collective trust. Poole married a woman named Evelyn and had 7 children, 4 daughters and 3 sons. He left the army in the early 1950s and worked various jobs, always quietly, always without drawing attention to what he had done in the war. His children knew their father had been a tank commander, knew he had lost his leg in combat, but he rarely spoke about the details. It wasn't shame or trauma that kept him quiet. It was the knowledge that some things can't be explained, only experienced. On May 30th, 1991, Lafayette Green Poole died in his sleep in Killeen, Texas. He was 71 years old. He was buried at Fort Sam Houston National Cemetery in San Antonio, the same fort where he had begun his military service 50 years earlier. The obituaries called him a war hero. His family called him a good man. His surviving crew members called him War Daddy one last time. The story of Lafayette Poole and his crew matters for several reasons, and not all of them are obvious. First, it demonstrates that individual skill and crew coordination can overcome material disadvantages. The Sherman was outgunned by German heavy tanks, but Poole's crew destroyed German tanks at a rate that should have been impossible according to the technical specifications. They did this through tactics, training, and mutual trust factors that don't appear on data sheets but matter enormously in actual combat. Second, it reveals something about American armored doctrine in World War II. The Sherman tank has a controversial reputation among historians and veterans. Some call it a death trap, pointing to its thin armor and tendency to catch fire. Others argue it was exactly the tank America needed to build reliable, easy to produce in huge numbers, mechanically sound, and good enough to win when properly employed. Poole's record suggests the latter interpretation is more accurate. The Sherman wasn't the problem. Inadequate training and poor tactics were the problem. Third, it shows that success in combat often comes from unexpected places. Poole was a staff sergeant, not a commissioned officer. He was leading a platoon despite his rank because his superiors recognized that he was simply better at the job than most lieutenants. The army's willingness to let him lead regardless of his rank was unusual for the time, and it paid enormous dividends. Sometimes the best leaders don't come from the expected backgrounds or follow the expected career paths. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, it illustrates the human cost of mechanized warfare. Poole lost his leg. Close lost much of his hearing. Richards, Oller, and Boggs all carried psychological scars that they rarely discussed, but that shaped the rest of their lives. They killed over 1,000 German soldiers, most of whom were just men like them, following orders, trying to survive. The statistics are impressive, but the reality behind them is ugly and brutal, and should never be celebrated without understanding what it actually meant. The title of this video asks how one tank commander destroyed 258 German tanks and armoured vehicles in 81 days with the same four-man crew. The literal answer is, through superior tactics, exceptional crew training, aggressive leadership, and a willingness to take risks that other commanders avoided. But the deeper answer is more complicated. Poole and his crew succeeded because they were bound together by mutual trust, because they had trained long enough to function as a single unit, because Poole demanded perfection and his crew delivered it, and because they were willing to fight in ways that maximized their advantages and minimized their weaknesses. They succeeded because the Sherman tank, despite its reputation, was actually a very effective weapon when commanded by someone who understood how to use it properly. And they succeeded because they were lucky that the German shells that hit their tanks didn't kill them, lucky that they didn't hit a mine or take a direct hit from artillery, lucky that they survived long enough to become exceptional. Every tank crew that went into combat faced the same odds. Most didn't survive 81 days. Most didn't destroy 12 enemy tanks. Most didn't achieve anything close to what Poole's crew achieved. The difference wasn't the equipment. The difference was the men and how they fought. In the larger story of World War II, Poole's record is a footnote. The war was won by industrial capacity, by the millions of soldiers and sailors and airmen who served, by strategic decisions made at levels far above a staff sergeant in a Sherman tank. But footnotes matter because they reveal truths that the big narrative obscures. They show that individual actions matter, that leadership matters, that training and tactics and trust matter. They show that wars are won not just by grand strategy, but by thousands of small tactical victories, by crews like Poole's, who did their jobs better than anyone expected. The Sherman tank that Poole commanded was just metal and mechanics, 33 tons of steel powered by a gasoline engine, armed with a gun that was good but not great, armoured adequately but not impressively. Thousands of identical tanks rolled off American assembly lines during the war. Most of them were destroyed or scrapped, or ended up as monuments in town squares. What made In the Mood different wasn't the tank. It was the 5 men who crewed it. Lafayette Poole understood something fundamental about leadership and warfare, that the human element is always more important than the hardware. Give average soldiers the best equipment in the world, and they'll achieve average results. Give exceptional soldiers adequate equipment, and they'll achieve exceptional results. Poole took a tank that many considered inferior and made it into the most lethal weapons platform on the Western Front, because he understood that the crew was the weapon, not the tank. His legacy isn't just the statistics, though the statistics are remarkable. His legacy is in the lessons he taught, both explicitly as an instructor after the war and implicitly through his example. Aggressive tactics work, crew cohesion matters, training saves lives. Leadership isn't about rank, it's about competence and trust. And sometimes the most effective way to fight isn't to avoid combat, but to close with the enemy and destroy them before they can destroy you. The Germans in 1944 were fighting for a cause that history rightly condemned. But the German tank crews Poole faced weren't ideological zealots. Most of them were just soldiers doing their jobs, and many of them were very good at those jobs. They had better equipment in many cases. They had the advantage of defensive positions. They had years of combat experience. And yet, again and again, they lost to an American crew in a supposedly inferior tank. They lost because Poole and his crew were better. Better trained, better coordinated, more aggressive, more willing to take risks. They lost because Poole understood that in tank combat, speed and surprise, and that first accurate shot matter more than armor thickness. They lost because Richards could put the Sherman exactly where it needed to be, because Oller could hit targets that others would have missed, because Boggs could feed the gun faster than German loaders could feed theirs, because Close could suppress enemy infantry while the main gun engaged armor. And they lost because Poole called them my pups, and they called him War Daddy, and that meant something. It meant that when the world was exploding around them and death was inches away, they knew their brothers would do their jobs perfectly. It meant that failure wasn't an option because letting each other down was worse than dying. It meant they were more than a crew. They were family, bound together by shared danger and mutual trust, and the knowledge that they were the best at what they did. On that night in September 1944, when the Panther's shell flipped in the Mood 3 into a ditch and tore Poole's leg apart and ended 81 days of continuous combat, something ended and something began. The most successful tank crew in American military history stopped fighting, but their story continued, carried forward by the men who had been there, taught to new generations of tankers, studied by military historians trying to understand what makes some units exceptional while others are merely adequate. The answer, in the end, is simple and impossible. They were exceptional because they made themselves exceptional, because Poole demanded it and his crew delivered it, because they trained harder, fought smarter, took bigger risks, and survived through a combination of skill and luck that can't be replicated but can be studied and learned from. The Sherman tank is often remembered as a symbol of American industrial might, of the arsenal of democracy that buried the Axis powers under mountains of materiel. Thousands of Shermans fought in Europe and the Pacific. Most of them were unremarkable, but 3 of them, all named In the Mood, all commanded by the same staff sergeant from Texas, became something more. They became proof that in war, as in everything else, the human element is supreme. When Lafayette Poole died in 1991, he took with him knowledge that couldn't be fully captured in after-action reports or training manuals. He knew what it felt like to sit in a Sherman's commander's hatch with German shells whistling past, knew the precise instant when you had to fire or die, knew how to read the fear in a young soldier's eyes and turn it into determination. He knew his crew, knew them better than he knew himself, knew them in ways that only shared combat can create. But what he left behind matters too. He left behind a record that has never been matched by any other American tank crew. He left behind lessons about leadership and tactics that are still taught in armor schools. He left behind children and grandchildren who carry his name, and he left behind a story that reminds us that in the mechanized horror of modern warfare, in battles fought by metal machines filled with high explosives, what ultimately matters is still the oldest thing in military history: the courage, skill, and brotherhood of the men who fight. 258 enemy vehicles destroyed. 12 confirmed tank kills. Over 1,000 enemy soldiers killed or captured. 81 days of continuous combat. Same 4-man crew throughout. 3 different Shermans, all named In the Mood, all eventually destroyed. 1 leg lost. Multiple decorations for valor. Decades of service to army and country afterward. 7 children raised. 71 years of life, most of it lived quietly, most of it unremarkable except for those 81 days when Lafayette Poole and his pups were the best tank crew in the entire United States Army. That's the story. Those are the facts. The legend is what people made of it afterward, but the reality is what happened on the roads of France and Belgium and Germany in the summer and fall of 1944. 5 men in a metal box, fighting their way across Europe, surviving what killed most others, doing their jobs with a level of excellence that seemed impossible and yet happened. History remembers the big decisions, the grand strategies, the famous generals. But wars are fought by staff sergeants and corporals and privates, by crews like Poole's who did extraordinary things and then went home and tried to be ordinary again. Their story matters because it shows what human beings are capable of when properly led, properly trained, and fully committed to each other and their mission. The question wasn't really how they did it. The question was always why others couldn't, and the answer to that question is harder to accept. Most couldn't because most weren't willing to pay the price. The price in training, in risk-taking, in absolute commitment. Poole paid that price and demanded his crew pay it too, and the result was 81 days of combat effectiveness that no other American tank crew matched. When In the Mood 3 burned in that ditch near Münsterbusch, when Poole was blown from the commander's hatch and his crew pulled him to safety, an era ended. The 3rd Armoured Division would continue fighting for another 7 months, all the way to the end of the war, but they would never have another crew like Poole's. No American unit would. That's not a criticism of the men who came after. It's a recognition that what Poole and his crew achieved was extraordinary in the literal sense, outside the ordinary, beyond what could reasonably be expected. They were the statistical outlier, the exception that proves the rule, and exceptions, by definition, are rare. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.